The video footage of their palace incident exploded across social media platforms within 24 hours of their arrest, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. Jake's dream of viral fame became a nightmare as the clips were shared with overwhelmingly negative commentary from viewers who expressed disgust at their disrespectful behavior toward the Queen's Guard and British institutions. News outlets from Australia to America picked up the story, with headlines describing them as entitled tourists and ugly Australians who had embarrassed their country on the international stage. The Australian High Commissioner was forced to issue a public statement distancing the government from their actions and emphasizing that such behavior did not represent Australian values or tourist conduct. Jake's previous social media content was thoroughly investigated by online communities, revealing a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior designed to generate views and followers. His history of pranks and stunts, previously seen by his audience as entertaining, was now being recontextualized as evidence of escalating disrespect for authority and public institutions. The three friends found themselves confined to their shared budget accommodation, unable to venture out without being recognized and confronted by angry members of the public. British citizens, particularly military veterans and their families, expressed outrage at the treatment of the guardsman, with many calling for the maximum possible penalties to be imposed. Marcus discovered that his university back home had launched an investigation into his conduct, potentially threatening his enrollment and future career prospects. The engineering program he was pursuing had strict conduct requirements, and international criminal charges for harassment of military personnel represented exactly the kind of behavior that could result in academic dismissal. Tyler's employer in Australia initiated disciplinary proceedings after becoming aware of his involvement in the incident. The finance company's reputation management team was concerned about the negative publicity associated with having an employee charged with such offenses, particularly given their corporate clients' sensitivity to public image issues. Support for the three Australians was virtually non-existent, with even their own families expressing embarrassment and disappointment at their behavior. Parents who had been proud to support their sons' European adventure found themselves fielding calls from neighbors and colleagues who had seen the news coverage and wanted explanations for the disgraceful conduct. The Royal British Legion, the UK's leading armed forces charity, issued a statement condemning the harassment of serving military personnel and highlighting the important role played by the Queen's Guard in maintaining British traditions and security. Their intervention elevated the incident from a tourist offense to a broader discussion about respect for military service. Guardsman Thompson became something of a folk hero in the aftermath of the incident, with his restrained but firm response being praised as an example of professional military bearing under pressure. Military blogs and veterans organizations shared his story as an illustration of the dignity and discipline expected of the Queen's Guard even when facing provocation. The palace's handling of the incident was also widely praised, with security experts noting how effectively the situation had been managed to protect both the institution's dignity and the safety of all involved parties. The swift response and thorough documentation were cited as examples of professional security work at the highest level. Online, fundraising campaigns emerged to support military charities in the names of the three Australians, with donors expressing their respect for the Queen's Guard while condemning the tourist behavior. The ironic result was that their actions generated thousands of pounds in donations to causes supporting the very people they had mocked. Death threats and harassment directed at the three friends forced police to increase security at their accommodation and warn them about the dangers of appearing in public. The anger directed toward them was intense and personal, with many people viewing their behavior as an attack on fundamental British values and military honor. International relations experts noted that the incident had created minor diplomatic tensions between Australia and the UK, requiring careful management to prevent broader implications for the country's relationship. The Australian government's quick condemnation of the behavior helped contain the damage, but the incident remained a source of embarrassment in diplomatic circles. Legal commentators predicted that the intense public interest and negative coverage would influence the court's approach to sentencing, potentially resulting in harsher penalties to demonstrate that such behavior would not be tolerated. The need to send a strong message to other potential troublemakers was cited as a factor that would work against the defendants. The incident sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior, social media culture, and the lengths people would go to achieve online fame. Educational institutions began using their case as an example of how poor judgment could have lifelong consequences, particularly when combined with the permanence of internet documentation. Mental health professionals noted the severe psychological impact that such intense negative attention could have on young people, warning about the potential for lasting emotional damage from public shaming campaigns. The three friends were experiencing firsthand how quickly social media fame could transform from blessing to curse. The morning sun cast golden rays across the historic grounds of Windsor Castle. The ancient stone walls stood tall and proud, watching over the rolling green lawns that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside the palace, young Prince George was finishing his breakfast. The 9-year-old boy sat at a large wooden table, carefully spreading jam on his toast while his nanny, Mrs. Margaret Thompson, poured fresh orange juice into his glass. Prince George had always been a curious and adventurous child. Unlike many children his age, he carried the weight of royal responsibility on his young shoulders, though he rarely showed it. This particular morning, he seemed more excited than usual. His school had organized a special visit to the royal archives, and George loved history more than any other subject. He had been talking about it for weeks. Mrs. Thompson had been with the royal family for nearly 15 years. She was a kind woman in her early 50s with gentle eyes and a warm smile that made everyone feel comfortable. She had taken care of Prince George since he was a baby, and she knew his every habit, every preference, and every little quirk. This morning, however, she noticed something different in the air. Perhaps it was the unusually quiet atmosphere, or maybe it was just her maternal instinct, but something felt slightly off. The royal security team had been briefed about the day's schedule. Detective Inspector James Morrison was the head of Prince George's personal protection unit. A former military officer with 20 years of experience, Morrison took his job very seriously. He had served in Afghanistan and Iraq before joining the Royal Protection Service. His team consisted of 4 highly trained officers, each expert in close protection and emergency response. They had planned every detail of the day's route, every possible scenario, every backup plan. As the morning progressed, Prince George changed into his school uniform. The navy blue blazer with the school crest sat perfectly on his shoulders. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, practicing the Windsor knot his father had taught him. His shoes were polished to perfection, reflecting the chandelier light from above. He grabbed his leather school bag, packed with notebooks and his favorite history books, and headed downstairs where his security team was waiting. The convoy was ready outside the main entrance. 3 black Range Rovers sat in formation, engines running quietly. The middle vehicle was for Prince George, while the front and rear cars carried additional security personnel. Everything seemed normal. The drivers had checked their routes 3 times. The communication systems were tested and working perfectly. Detective Morrison did one final check of his team, making sure everyone was in position and ready. Prince George climbed into the middle vehicle, settling into the comfortable leather seat. Mrs. Thompson sat beside him, adjusting her seatbelt and placing her handbag on her lap. The young prince looked out the window, watching the palace grounds pass by as they drove through the main gates. Tourists were already gathering outside, cameras ready to catch a glimpse of any royal family member. Some waved excitedly when they recognized the convoy. The journey to the royal archives usually took about 30 minutes. The route was carefully chosen to avoid busy traffic areas and potential security risks. They drove through the quiet streets of Windsor, passing historic buildings and quaint shops that had stood there for centuries. The morning traffic was light, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. Detective Morrison sat in the front passenger seat, constantly scanning the environment. His eyes moved from the road ahead to the side mirrors, checking every car, every pedestrian, every possible threat. His hand rested near his radio, ready to communicate with the other vehicles at any moment. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him to stay extra alert. About 15 minutes into the journey, they approached a busy intersection near the town center. The traffic lights turned red and the convoy came to a smooth stop. This was a common occurrence, and the team had stopped at this same intersection dozens of times before. Nothing seemed unusual. People crossed the street in front of them, going about their daily business. Shop owners were opening their stores, setting up displays and preparing for the day ahead. Prince George was reading a book about British monarchs, completely absorbed in the stories of his ancestors. Mrs. Thompson was checking her phone, reviewing the schedule for the rest of the day. The security team remained vigilant, but there was no immediate cause for concern. The traffic light was expected to change in about 30 seconds. Then, without warning, a white delivery van pulled up alongside them. It stopped in the left lane, just meters away from Prince George's vehicle. The van had no company markings, no logos, nothing that would identify its purpose. Detective Morrison immediately noticed this detail. His body tensed and his hand moved to his radio. Something about the van felt wrong. The driver of the van was wearing dark sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact with the security team. Morrison's years of experience kicked in. He quietly alerted the other vehicles through his radio, using code words that wouldn't alarm Prince George or Mrs. Thompson. The security officers in the other cars immediately heightened their awareness. The traffic light was still red. Seconds felt like hours. Morrison's eyes never left the white van. He noticed the side door was slightly ajar, which was unusual for a vehicle in traffic. His hand moved closer to his weapon, though he remained calm and professional. He didn't want to cause panic unless absolutely necessary. Suddenly, the side door of the van slid open completely. 3 men dressed in dark clothing jumped out before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. They moved with purpose and speed, heading directly toward Prince George's car. Their faces were covered with black masks, and they carried what appeared to be weapons in their hands. Detective Morrison's training took over instantly. In one fluid motion, he shouted code red into his radio while reaching for his weapon. The driver of Prince George's vehicle immediately engaged the door locks and began calculating escape routes. The security officers in the front and rear vehicles sprang into action, exiting their cars with weapons drawn. Mrs. Thompson gasped and immediately pulled Prince George down below the window level, shielding him with her own body. The young prince, confused and frightened, tried to understand what was happening. His history book fell to the floor as reality crashed into what had been a peaceful morning. The 3 masked men were now running toward the vehicle, their intentions clear and dangerous. The quiet morning had transformed into a moment of extreme crisis. Every second counted, and the Royal Protection Team knew they had only moments to respond before the unthinkable could happen. Detective Morrison immediately moved to Prince George's vehicle, his weapon now holstered but his hand still resting on it. He tapped on the window with a specific pattern, a signal that Mrs. Thompson recognized as the all-clear code. She carefully released her protective hold on Prince George and pressed the button to lower the window just a few inches. "Are you both unharmed?" Morrison's voice was calm now, though his eyes continued to scan the surrounding area for any additional threats. His professional demeanor was meant to reassure them, though inside his mind was racing through everything that had just happened and everything that still needed to be done. Mrs. Thompson nodded, though her voice wavered slightly when she spoke. "Yes, we're fine. Just shaken." She looked down at Prince George, whose face had gone pale. The young boy was sitting up now, his hands gripping the edge of the seat. His eyes held a mixture of fear and confusion that no child should have to experience. "Your Highness, you were very brave," Morrison said, making eye contact with the prince. "You followed instructions perfectly. That's exactly what you needed to do." He knew that children often process trauma in complex ways, and positive reinforcement in these critical moments could make a significant difference in how the boy would remember this event. Prince George managed a small nod, but he didn't speak. His throat felt tight and his hands were still trembling. Everything had happened so fast. One moment he was reading about King Henry VIII, and the next moment masked men were attacking their car. The violent crash of the crowbar against the window kept replaying in his mind. The street was now filled with police vehicles and emergency responders. Officers were establishing a perimeter, pushing back the growing crowd of onlookers. Several civilians were being interviewed as witnesses, their phone recordings being collected as evidence. An ambulance had arrived, though fortunately no one appeared to be seriously injured. The captured attacker lay face down on the pavement, his hands secured behind his back with heavy-duty restraints. 2 police officers stood guard over him while a third read him his rights. The man had stopped struggling and now lay silent, perhaps realizing the severity of his situation. His mask had been removed, revealing a weathered face with a thick beard and cold, dark eyes that revealed nothing. Officer Chen kept the vehicle's engine running, ready to move at a moment's notice if the situation changed. His eyes constantly checked the mirrors, watching every person who came near their position. His partner in the front passenger seat had already contacted the palace, informing them of the incident and requesting immediate instructions on how to proceed. Morrison's radio crackled with updates. The white van had been spotted heading toward the motorway with multiple police units in pursuit. A helicopter was being dispatched to join the chase. The license plate had already been run through the database and had come back as registered to a stolen vehicle from 3 days earlier. This information confirmed what Morrison already suspected. This was a carefully planned operation, not a random act of violence. Within minutes, a senior palace official arrived at the scene. Sir Robert Hamilton was the head of Royal Security Operations, a distinguished man in his 60s who had served the crown for over 30 years. He approached Morrison with purposeful strides, his face grave with concern. "Report," Sir Robert said simply, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Morrison provided a concise summary of the events, his military training evident in his clear and factual delivery. Sir Robert listened without interruption, his experienced mind already analyzing the implications. An attempted kidnapping of a direct heir to the throne was not just a security failure, it was a national crisis. "The prince needs to return to the palace immediately," Sir Robert declared. "We'll use an alternate route. I want a full tactical escort, helicopter oversight, and every available unit between here and home." He turned to look at Prince George's vehicle, his expression softening slightly when he saw the young boy's frightened face through the window. Morrison agreed and began issuing new orders to his team. 2 additional security vehicles were already en route to join the convoy. The route back to the palace would be completely different from their original path, chosen to minimize any risk of a secondary attack. Every bridge would be checked, every intersection secured, every possible ambush point eliminated. Inside the vehicle, Mrs. Thompson was trying to comfort Prince George. She spoke to him in gentle tones, holding his hand and assuring him that he was safe now. But the boy seemed distant, his mind clearly processing the trauma of what had just happened. He kept looking out the window at all the police officers and emergency vehicles trying to make sense of the chaos. "Mrs. Thompson," Prince George finally spoke, his voice small and uncertain. "Why did those men want to hurt me?" "What did I do wrong?" The question broke Mrs. Thompson's heart. How could she explain to a 9-year-old child that his birthright, the very thing that made him special, also made him a target? She chose her words carefully, knowing that this conversation would likely stay with him for the rest of his life. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," she said softly. "Some people in this world make very bad choices, but you have wonderful people around you who will always keep you safe. Detective Morrison and all these officers, they're heroes. They protected you because you're important and you're loved." Prince George seemed to consider this, but his young mind was still struggling with the concept. He had always known he was different from other children, that his life came with special responsibilities and privileges. But until this moment, it had all seemed rather abstract. Now the reality of his position had become terrifyingly concrete. The new security vehicles arrived and the enhanced convoy began to form. 6 vehicles now instead of 3, each filled with armed officers trained in counter-terrorism and close protection. A police helicopter appeared overhead, its distinctive sound cutting through the urban noise. The pilot radioed confirmation that the route ahead was clear. Sir Robert approached Prince George's vehicle one final time before they departed. He spoke briefly with Morrison, then requested that the window be lowered so he could address the prince directly. When Prince George looked up at him, Sir Robert gave a formal bow of respect. "Your Royal Highness," he said with genuine warmth, "you have shown remarkable courage today. Your grandmother, the Queen, has been informed and sends her love. We're going to take you home now, where your family is waiting for you." The mention of his family seemed to break through Prince George's shock. His eyes welled up with tears for the first time since the attack. "I want to see my father," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And you shall very soon," Sir Robert promised. "Your father is already at the palace waiting for you." The convoy began to move slowly at first, then picking up speed as they left the chaotic scene behind. Police officers blocked intersections ahead of time, allowing the convoy to pass through without stopping. The helicopter maintained its position overhead, the pilot continuously scanning for any unusual activity along their route. Inside the vehicle, Prince George leaned against Mrs. Thompson, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of his fear. She wrapped her arm around him, holding him close as they drove through the streets of Windsor. Through the window, she could see people on the sidewalk stopping to watch the convoy pass, some with phones out, others simply staring with concern and curiosity. The journey back to the palace took only 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every turn, every passing car, every pedestrian seemed like a potential threat. Morrison never relaxed his vigilance, his eyes constantly moving, his hand never far from his weapon. He knew that the immediate danger had passed, but his training wouldn't allow him to lower his guard until the prince was safely behind the palace walls. As they approached Windsor Castle, the massive iron gates were already open and waiting. Additional security personnel lined the driveway, their presence a visible reminder of the seriousness of what had occurred. The ancient walls of the castle had protected British monarchs for nearly 1,000 years, and today they would once again serve as a sanctuary from a dangerous world. The convoy pulled through the palace gates and came to a stop in the private courtyard. Prince William was already there, standing on the stone steps with his hands clasped tightly together. The moment Prince George's vehicle stopped, William rushed forward, his usual composed royal demeanor completely abandoned in favor of pure parental concern. Morrison quickly exited and opened the rear door. Prince George practically fell out of the vehicle and into his father's arms. William caught him, wrapping him in a tight embrace that conveyed all the fear, relief, and love a father feels when his child has been in danger. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. They didn't need to. The hug said everything. "I've got you," William whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I've got you." He pulled back slightly to look at his son's face, checking for any signs of injury. His hands gently touched George's cheeks, his shoulders, his arms, as if needing physical confirmation that his boy was truly unharmed. Prince George buried his face in his father's chest, and finally, the tears came. All the fear, confusion, and shock that he had been holding inside poured out. His small body shook with sobs as William held him, gently rocking him back and forth the way he had when George was a toddler. Mrs. Thompson emerged from the vehicle, her own eyes red and wet. She had maintained her composure during the entire ordeal, but now, in the safety of the palace grounds, her emotions were catching up with her. Princess Catherine appeared from inside the palace, moving quickly toward them. When she saw George crying in William's arms, her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, my darling," Catherine breathed as she reached them. She placed her hand on George's back, standing close to William so that their son was surrounded by both parents. "You're home now. You're safe. We're here." The royal household staff maintained a respectful distance, but everyone present was visibly shaken. News of the attack had spread through the palace within minutes of it happening. Staff members who had known Prince George since birth stood with tears in their eyes, grateful that their young prince had been protected. Sir Robert Hamilton approached the family after giving them a moment together. "Your Royal Highnesses, we need to move inside. The situation is still developing and we need to ensure complete security." His voice was gentle but firm, the voice of a man who had balanced protocol with compassion for decades. William nodded, though he didn't release his hold on George. He lifted the boy into his arms, something he hadn't done in years, and carried him toward the palace entrance. George wrapped his arms around his father's neck and kept his face hidden against his shoulder. Catherine walked alongside them, one hand on George's back, the other holding William's arm. They moved through the grand corridors of Windsor Castle, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own dangers throughout history. Staff members bowed as they passed, but the usual formality felt different today. There was something more genuine in their gestures, more heartfelt in their concern. The family gathered in a private sitting room, away from the formal staterooms. This space was more personal, filled with family photographs and comfortable furniture that actually showed signs of use. William gently set George down on a sofa, and Catherine immediately sat beside him, pulling him close. Detective Morrison had followed them inside, along with Sir Robert. They stood near the doorway, knowing they needed to brief the family but wanting to give them space to process what had happened. A palace physician was also present, A kind elderly woman named Dr. Sarah Bennett who had treated the royal children for years. "George, darling, Dr. Bennett needs to examine you," Catherine said softly, "just to make sure you're not hurt anywhere. Is that all right?" Prince George nodded silently. Dr. Bennett approached with a warm smile, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle the boy. She conducted a thorough but gentle examination, checking for any signs of physical trauma. Apart from some minor bruising from the seatbelt when the car reversed suddenly, George was physically unharmed. "He's fine physically," Dr. Bennett reported to William and Catherine, "but I would recommend having him speak with a counselor in the coming days. Experiences like this can have psychological effects that aren't immediately apparent." William thanked her, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. Not anger at anyone in the room, but at the people who had dared to threaten his son. He turned to Sir Robert and Morrison. "I want to know everything. Who were they? What did they want? How did this happen?" Sir Robert gestured for everyone to sit, then began his briefing. "The situation is still unfolding, Your Highness. We have one suspect in custody. The other two escaped in the white van, but multiple police units are in pursuit. The vehicle has been spotted heading north on the M25. We expect to intercept them within the hour." Morrison stepped forward to add his perspective. "The attack was coordinated and planned. The suspects knew the route and the timing. They positioned themselves at that specific intersection, which suggests they had been conducting surveillance for some time. This wasn't a random attack or a crime of opportunity." Catherine's face went pale. "You're saying they've been watching him? Watching us?" "We believe so, ma'am," Sir Robert confirmed. "We're currently reviewing all security footage from the past several weeks, checking for any suspicious activity around the school, the palace, and the routes Prince George regularly travels." William stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He stared out at the palace grounds, his mind racing. As a father, he wanted to lock his children away from the world, to keep them safe in the strongest fortress available. But as a future king, he knew that wasn't possible. The royal family had to maintain their connection to the public, had to continue their duties despite the risks. "What about Charlotte and Louis?" William asked, referring to his other two children. "Are they safe?" "We've already enhanced security for Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis," Sir Robert assured him. "They've been informed of a security alert but not the specific details. We thought it best to let you decide how to explain the situation to them." Catherine looked at George, who was sitting quietly on the sofa, staring at his hands. He seemed so small and vulnerable in that moment. She couldn't imagine having to explain to his younger siblings that someone had tried to kidnap their brother. How do you steal a child's innocence while also preparing them for a dangerous reality? A palace aide knocked softly and entered the room. "Your Highnesses, Her Majesty the Queen is on the telephone. She wishes to speak with you." William nodded and moved to the phone on a side table. The conversation was brief but emotional. Queen Elizabeth had been informed of the attack immediately and had been receiving updates throughout. Her voice, though weakened by age, carried the strength of a monarch who had faced countless crises during her long reign. After the call, William returned to the sofa and sat on the other side of George. The boy was sandwiched between his parents, safe in their protective embrace. William took his son's hand and waited until George looked up at him. "Granny sends her love," William said gently. "She wants you to know how proud she is of you, how brave you were." "I wasn't brave," George said quietly, his first words since arriving at the palace. "I was scared. I hid." "Being scared doesn't mean you weren't brave," William explained. "Bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. You listened to Mrs. Thompson and Detective Morrison. You stayed calm and followed their instructions. That took courage, George. Real courage," Catherine added. "And it's okay to be scared, sweetheart. Even grown-ups get scared. Your father gets scared, I get scared. What matters is that you're safe now, and you have people around you who will always protect you." George seemed to consider this, his young mind trying to process such complex concepts. After a moment, he looked up at his parents with eyes that seemed older than they had been that morning. "Will this happen again?" It was the question every parent dreads, the one with no easy answer. William and Catherine exchanged a glance, silently communicating about how to respond. They had always tried to be honest with their children while still protecting their innocence. This moment required that same delicate balance. "We can't promise that bad things will never happen," William said carefully. "But we can promise that you will always have people protecting you. Detective Morrison and his team, they're the best in the world at what they do. Today, they proved that. They kept you safe, and they will continue to keep you safe." "Why do I need protection?" George asked, the question that had been building inside him finally emerging. "Why did those men want to take me?" Catherine took a deep breath. This was the moment where they had to explain something that even adults struggled to understand. "You're special, George. You were born into a family with a very long history and important responsibilities. Someday, a long time from now, you'll be king. That makes you special. But it also means some people might try to use you for bad reasons." As the afternoon progressed, the investigation into the attempted kidnapping intensified. In a secure operations room deep within Windsor Castle, a team of intelligence officers, police detectives, and security experts gathered around a large table covered with documents, photographs, and computer screens. The walls were lined with monitors showing live feeds from various security cameras and news broadcasts. Detective Chief Inspector Amanda Foster led the investigation. She was a veteran of the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Command, known for her sharp analytical mind and calm demeanor under pressure. She stood at the head of the table, organizing the incoming information into a coherent picture of what had happened and why. "We have a positive identification on the captured suspect," she announced to the room. "His name is Viktor Petrov, a 34-year-old foreign national with previous convictions in 3 countries. He's been on our watch list for 6 months as a suspected member of an international criminal organization specializing in high-value kidnappings." Morrison, who had joined the briefing after ensuring Prince George was safely settled, leaned forward with interest. "What do we know about the organization?" Inspector Foster pulled up several photographs on the main screen. "They operate across Europe and have been linked to at least 7 kidnapping attempts in the past 2 years. Their targets are always high-profile individuals or their family members. They typically demand ransoms in the millions, sometimes in cryptocurrency to avoid detection." "Have they ever succeeded?" asked Commander Richard Walsh, head of the palace's internal security division. "Twice," Foster replied grimly. "A German industrialist's daughter in Hamburg, and the son of a French media mogul in Paris. Both were eventually released after ransom payments, but the psychological trauma was significant. The organization is sophisticated, well-funded, and very dangerous." Sir Robert Hamilton studied the photographs with a concerned expression. "And they've now set their sights on the British royal family. This represents an escalation we cannot ignore." The investigation had already uncovered disturbing evidence. Security camera footage from the past 3 weeks showed the white van parked at various locations along Prince George's usual routes. The kidnappers had clearly spent weeks studying his patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, and planning their attack. They had known exactly when and where to strike. "The traffic light was tampered with," Foster continued, bringing up technical data on the screen. "Someone hacked into the traffic management system and extended the red light duration at that specific intersection. It gave them the extra time they needed to position their vehicle and attempt the extraction." Morrison shook his head in disbelief. That level of technical capability suggests this goes beyond a simple criminal gang. They have resources, expertise, and insider knowledge. "Exactly our concern," Foster agreed. "We're investigating the possibility of a leak within the palace staff or security services. Someone provided them with detailed information about Prince George's schedule and security protocols." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. A traitor within their ranks was every security professional's worst nightmare. It meant they couldn't fully trust their own systems, their own people. Every procedure would need to be reviewed, every staff member investigated. Meanwhile, the manhunt for the escaped kidnappers continued across the country. Police helicopters tracked the white van as it weaved through traffic on the motorway. Multiple patrol cars had joined the pursuit, maintaining a careful distance to avoid spooking the suspects into doing something desperate. The operation was being coordinated from Scotland Yard's Central Command Center. Inspector Thomas Bradley commanded the pursuit team. His voice crackled over the radio to all units involved. "Maintain visual contact, but do not engage unless they stop or present an immediate danger to civilians. These suspects are highly dangerous and may be armed." The van suddenly swerved off the motorway at an exit ramp, tires squealing as it took the turn at dangerous speed. The driver clearly knew the area well. navigating through smaller roads and residential neighborhoods. The police vehicles followed, their sirens echoing off the buildings as concerned residents looked out their windows. Back at Windsor Castle, Prince George had been moved to his private quarters. His younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, had been brought to see him. Charlotte, who was 7 years old, immediately noticed something was wrong. Her brother's eyes were red from crying, and there were too many serious-faced adults around. "George, are you sick?" she asked with innocent concern, sitting beside him on his bed. Prince Louis, only 5 years old, was less perceptive but equally worried. He climbed onto the bed and hugged his older brother without asking questions. Sometimes he seemed to understand. A hug was all that was needed. William and Catherine had decided to tell the children a simplified version of the truth. Lying would only make things worse when they inevitably learned what had happened. The story was all over the news now. Within hours, it would be international headlines. "Someone tried to do something bad today," William explained to Charlotte and Louis, choosing his words carefully. "But the police officers who protect George stopped them. George is safe, and so are you. We just wanted you to know so you wouldn't be worried if you see extra security people around." Charlotte's eyes widened. "Like the bad people in the stories?" "Something like that," Catherine said softly. "But remember, in all the best stories, the good people always win. And today, the good people won. Detective Morrison and his team are heroes." Louis looked confused but seemed to accept his parents' calm demeanor as a sign that everything was all right. Charlotte, however, was more thoughtful. She scooted closer to George and took his hand. "I'm glad you're okay," she said simply. And that gesture of sisterly love seemed to comfort George more than any adult words could. The pursuit of the white van continued for another 40 minutes, leading police through industrial areas and back roads. The suspects were skilled drivers, but they were running out of options. Roadblocks were being set up ahead of them, and the helicopter overhead meant they couldn't hide. Finally, the van screeched to a halt in an abandoned warehouse district. The two suspects jumped out and ran in different directions, splitting up to divide the pursuing officers. It was a common tactic, but the police had anticipated this possibility. Teams had already been positioned to cut off escape routes. Officer Sarah Mitchell, a 10-year veteran of the Armed Response Unit, spotted one suspect running between two old buildings. She pursued on foot, her training and fitness allowing her to keep pace despite the suspect's head start. "Stop, armed police!" she shouted, but the man kept running. The chase led through narrow alleyways and around shipping containers. The suspect stumbled over debris, regaining his balance just in time to vault over a low fence. Officer Mitchell followed, her radio updating her position to the other units converging on the area. The suspect reached a dead end, a high brick wall blocking his path. He spun around, his hand reaching into his jacket. Officer Mitchell immediately raised her weapon, her voice commanding and clear. "Hands where I can see them." "Do not move." For a tense moment, they faced each other. The suspect's hand was still inside his jacket, his breathing heavy from the run. Officer Mitchell maintained her stance, her finger on the trigger guard, ready but controlled. She had been in situations like this before and knew that the next few seconds could determine whether she went home to her family that night. "There's nowhere to go," Mitchell said, her voice calmer now. "You're surrounded. Make the smart choice. Take your hand out slowly and get on the ground." The suspect's eyes darted around looking for an escape that didn't exist. Police sirens were getting closer. The helicopter circled overhead. Slowly, very slowly, he removed his hand from his jacket. It was empty. He had been bluffing, perhaps hoping to provoke the officer into a reaction that would give him an opening. Within seconds, backup officers arrived and secured the suspect. He was restrained and searched, revealing no weapons but a substantial amount of cash in various currencies and a burner phone. Officer Mitchell allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply, the adrenaline still coursing through her system. The second suspect was captured shortly afterward. Cornered in a warehouse by another team of officers, he surrendered without resistance, knowing that further flight was futile. Both men were transported to a secure facility where they would be interrogated by counter-terrorism specialists. Back at Windsor Castle, news of the captures was relayed to the family. William felt a wave of relief wash over him. Though he knew the danger hadn't completely passed, these men were just the visible part of the organization. The people who had planned the operation, who had funded it, who had provided the intelligence, they were still out there. That evening, as darkness fell over the palace grounds, extra security measures were visible everywhere. Armed officers patrolled the perimeter. Additional cameras had been installed. Access points were restricted. The palace had essentially gone into lockdown mode, transforming from a historic residence into a fortress. Prince George lay in his bed, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The events of the day kept playing through his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The sound of the crowbar hitting the window, the masked faces, the terror of not knowing what was happening or why. Catherine sat beside his bed, gently stroking his hair the way she had when he was younger. "Would you like me to read you a story?" she offered. George shook his head. "I don't think I can focus on a story right now." "That's understandable," Catherine said. "Do you want to talk about what happened? Sometimes talking helps." For a long moment, George was quiet. Then in a small voice, he asked, "Mum, will I ever feel safe again?" The question broke Catherine's heart, but she knew she had to be honest. "Yes, darling. It will take time, but you will feel safe again. What happened today was frightening. But it also showed you something important. You have people who will protect you no matter what. Detective Morrison, Officer Chen, Mrs. Thompson, they all put themselves in danger to keep you safe. And they always will." "I keep thinking about what would have happened if they hadn't been there," George admitted. "But they were there," Catherine emphasized. "And that's what matters. You can't live your life thinking about what might have happened. You have to focus on what did happen. You were protected, you were brave, and you came home safely." The interrogation room at the high-security facility was stark and cold. Viktor Petrov sat handcuffed to a metal table, his earlier confidence completely gone. Inspector Foster sat across from him, a folder of evidence spread before her. She had conducted hundreds of interrogations in her career and knew exactly how to read people, how to find the cracks in their armor. "You're looking at a minimum of 25 years in prison," Foster stated calmly. "Attempted kidnapping of a minor, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, possession of weapons, and that's before we add the terrorism charges. The only question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life in a British prison or whether you want to help yourself by cooperating." Petrov stared at the table, saying nothing. His lawyer, a court-appointed solicitor who looked overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case, whispered something in his ear. Petrov shook his head slightly. Foster leaned back in her chair, changing tactics. "We know you're not the mastermind here, Victor. You're a hired hand following orders. The people who planned this operation, they're the ones who should face the harshest penalties. But if you don't talk, you'll take the fall for all of them." "I want a deal," Petrov finally said, his accent thick but his English clear. "Protection. New identity. I talk, but I get protection." "That depends on what you have to tell us," Foster replied. "Who ordered the kidnapping? Who provided the information about Prince George's schedule?" Petrov looked genuinely frightened now. "These people, they have long reach. They find anyone who betrays them. I have seen what they do. And we have an entire government dedicated to protecting witnesses," Foster countered. "But you need to give us something substantial. Names, locations, how the organization operates." The interrogation continued for hours, slowly peeling back layers of information. Petrov revealed that the organization was run by a man known only as the director, whose real identity remained a mystery even to his operatives. The group operated across international borders, using encrypted communications and cryptocurrency payments to avoid detection. The inside information about Prince George's schedule had come from an unexpected source. Not a palace staff member or security officer, but a technology consultant who had worked on updating the palace's digital security systems 6 months earlier. He had planted malware that allowed the organization to monitor internal communications and scheduling databases. This revelation sent shockwaves through the security team. Inspector Foster immediately contacted Sir Robert Hamilton with the information. A full digital forensic investigation was launched, with every palace computer system being checked for malicious software. The technology consultant was located within hours, arrested at his home in London. At Windsor Castle, the days following the attack were difficult for everyone. Prince George was receiving counseling from Dr. Elizabeth Hart, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. The sessions were gentle and patient, allowing George to process his experience at his own pace. "How are you sleeping?" Dr. Hart asked during one session, sitting in a comfortable chair across from George. "Not very well," George admitted. "I keep having dreams about it." Sometimes I wake up and forget where I am for a moment. That's a very normal response to what you experienced, Dr. Hart explained. Your brain is trying to make sense of something frightening. These dreams will become less frequent with time. Is there anything specific that helps you feel better? George thought about it. Talking to my father helps, and Charlotte has been staying in my room at night. She falls asleep in the chair, and knowing she's there makes me feel less alone. Dr. Hart made notes, appreciating the family's instinctive support system. Those are wonderful coping mechanisms. Your family's love and presence is one of the most powerful healing tools you have. William had taken time away from his royal duties to be with his son. He and George spent hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. They played games, read books, and took walks in the secured palace gardens. William shared stories from his own childhood, including times when he had felt scared or vulnerable. When I was about your age, William told George one afternoon as they sat by a pond, I was terrified of disappointing people. I felt this enormous pressure to be perfect because of who I was. It took me a long time to understand that being royal doesn't mean being perfect. It means being human, with all the fears and doubts that come with that. Do you still get scared? George asked. All the time, William admitted, especially when it comes to you, Charlotte, and Louis. Today, when I heard what had happened, I was more frightened than I've ever been in my life. But that fear comes from love. It reminds me what's truly important. The investigation continued to expand. The technology consultant, under interrogation, provided access codes and detailed information about how he had infiltrated the palace systems. The digital forensics team discovered that the breach was more extensive than initially thought. The criminals had access to not just scheduling information, but also security protocols and camera blind spots. This is a complete security overhaul, Commander Walsh reported to Sir Robert. Every system needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. We're looking at months of work. Then we start immediately, Sir Robert declared. And I want every single person who has access to palace systems revetted. Background checks, financial records, the works. I don't care if they've worked here for 30 years. Everyone gets checked. The public reaction to the attempted kidnapping was enormous. News outlets around the world covered the story extensively. Outside the palace gates, flowers and messages of support piled up, left by ordinary citizens who felt a connection to the young prince. The outpouring of love and concern was touching, demonstrating that despite the changing nature of the monarchy, the British people still cared deeply about the royal family. Mrs. Thompson, who had received praise for her protective actions during the attack, found herself struggling with her own emotions. She met with a counselor provided by the palace, discussing the trauma of those terrifying moments when she had used her own body to shield Prince George. I keep thinking about what could have happened, she confessed during one session. If the window had broken, if they had gotten the door open, if I hadn't been strong enough to protect him. But the window didn't break, the counselor reminded her gently. The door didn't open, and you were exactly strong enough. You did everything right, and because of your actions and those of the security team, Prince George is safe. Detective Morrison was hailed as a hero, though he deflected the praise to his entire team. He met with Commissioner James Bradley of the Metropolitan Police, who wanted a full debrief of the incident. Your response was textbook perfect, the commissioner said. Split-second decisions, coordinated team action, and most importantly, the protectee remained safe. Your team will be commended for their actions. We were doing our jobs, Morrison replied modestly, but I won't deny it was the most intense situation I've faced in my career. When that armed suspect appeared, there was a moment where I thought we might have to engage in a firefight in the middle of a civilian area. Your restraint was commendable, Bradley noted. You assessed the situation correctly and avoided escalating to lethal force. That's the mark of a true professional. The two suspects captured during the pursuit were also being interrogated. They provided additional pieces of the puzzle, revealing safe houses where the organization operated, methods they used to scout targets, and financial transactions that could be traced. Each piece of information was carefully documented and analyzed, building a comprehensive picture of the criminal network. International cooperation became crucial. Europol, Interpol, and intelligence agencies from multiple countries began sharing information about the organization. Similar operations had been attempted in Spain, Italy, and Belgium. The attempted kidnapping of Prince George had finally brought enough attention to the group that a coordinated international response could be mounted. In a secure conference room, Representatives from 6 countries met via encrypted video link. Inspector Foster presented the British findings, while colleagues from other nations added their own intelligence. A picture emerged of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for nearly 5 years, slowly building capabilities and ambition. "We need to coordinate simultaneous raids," suggested a French intelligence officer. "If we move on the safe houses in all our countries at the same time, we can prevent them from warning each other and fleeing." The plan was approved at the highest levels of government. A date was set for 1 week later, giving teams in each country time to prepare. The operation would be called Guardian Shield, symbolizing the protection of innocent victims. Back at Windsor Castle, Prince George was slowly beginning to heal. He returned to his studies with private tutors, though the planned visit to the Royal Archives had been cancelled indefinitely. His teachers noticed he was more quiet than before, more withdrawn but also more focused on his work, perhaps finding comfort in the routine. Charlotte and Louis were protective of their older brother, in ways that were both touching and heartbreaking. Charlotte appointed herself as George's guardian, staying close to him whenever possible. Louis, too young to fully understand what had happened, simply knew that his brother needed extra hugs and often provided them without being asked. Princess Catherine organized a small family dinner one evening, wanting to bring some normalcy back to their lives. They gathered in a private dining room, just the 5 of them without staff hovering nearby. It was a simple meal, the kind of family dinner that happened in homes across the country every night. "I have an announcement," Charlotte declared seriously during dessert. "I've decided that when I grow up, I'm going to be a police officer like Detective Morrison. Then I can protect people too." William smiled at his daughter's determination. "That's a wonderful ambition, Charlotte. The world needs more people willing to protect others." "Can I be a police officer too?" Louis asked, not wanting to be left out. "You can be anything you want to be," Catherine assured him. "Both of you can." George listened to his siblings with a small smile, the first genuine smile he had shown in days. Seeing them plan their futures with such innocent confidence reminded him that life continued, that the world was still full of possibilities and hope, even after frightening experiences. 1 week after the attempted kidnapping, Operation Guardian Shield launched simultaneously across 6 European countries. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, tactical teams breached doors of suspected safe houses, arresting members of the criminal organization. The coordination was flawless, with real-time communication between all participating nations. In London, armed police stormed a warehouse in East London that had been identified as a planning location for the kidnapping attempt. Inside, they found computers, surveillance equipment, and detailed maps of routes around Windsor and London. Most importantly, they found documents that provided evidence of the organization's structure and operations. Similar raids in Paris, Berlin, Rome, Madrid, and Brussels yielded arrests and evidence. By the end of the day, 43 suspects were in custody across Europe. It was the largest coordinated operation against an international kidnapping ring in decades. Inspector Foster stood in the warehouse, examining the evidence with satisfaction. On one wall was a large board covered with photographs, including several of Prince George taken from a distance. Seeing those images, knowing how carefully they had stalked a child, strengthened her resolve to ensure these criminals face the full weight of justice. "We've got financial records here," one of the forensic accountants reported. "Bank accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, payment records. This is going to take months to fully analyze, but it looks like they were operating with budgets in the millions." The investigation revealed that the organization had been planning the Prince George kidnapping for over 6 months. They had studied security patterns, identified potential weaknesses, and invested heavily in technology and personnel. The ransom they planned to demand was £50 million, to be paid in untraceable cryptocurrency. What they hadn't counted on was the training, dedication, and quick response of the Royal Protection Team. Detective Morrison's split-second decisions and the coordinated action of his officers had disrupted months of planning in just a few minutes. At Windsor Castle, news of the successful raids brought a sense of relief to the family. William received the update from Sir Robert personally, learning that the immediate threat had been significantly reduced. However, everyone understood that complete safety could never be guaranteed. The royal family would always face unique risks. Prince George had been having a session with Dr. Hart when the news came. William decided to tell him immediately, believing that knowing the criminals had been caught might help with his recovery. "George, I have some important news," William said, sitting down beside his son. "The police have arrested many of the people who were involved in what happened to you. They've been caught in several countries, and they're going to face justice for what they tried to do." George processed this information quietly. "Does that mean it's over?" "It means you're safe," William clarified. "The specific people who threatened you are in custody. But George, I need you to understand something. Our lives will always involve security measures. That's part of who we are. What happened was frightening, but it was also unusual. The important thing is that we have people protecting us, and those people are very good at their jobs." Dr. Hart added her perspective. "George, what your father is saying is important. We can't live our lives in fear of what might happen. Detective Morrison and his team proved that the security systems work. They protected you exactly as they were trained to do. You can trust in that protection." Over the following weeks, George continued to heal. The nightmares became less frequent. His appetite returned. He began to engage more with his studies and showed interest in activities he had enjoyed before the attack. The resilience of childhood, combined with professional support and family love, was helping him recover. One afternoon, George asked his father if he could meet Detective Morrison again. William arranged it, and Morrison came to the palace in his civilian clothes rather than his uniform, wanting the meeting to feel less formal and intimidating. They met in one of the palace's private sitting rooms. George stood when Morrison entered, suddenly looking very formal and grown up. He had prepared something to say and had been practicing with his mother. "Detective Morrison," George began, his voice clear despite his nervousness, "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. You and your team saved my life, and I will never forget that. You're a hero, and I'm grateful to you." Morrison was visibly moved by the young prince's words. He knelt down to be at eye level with George. "Your Highness, it was my honor to protect you. You were very brave that day. You stayed calm and followed instructions, which made our job easier. I want you to know that my team and I will always be here to keep you safe." George surprised everyone by stepping forward and hugging the detective. Morrison hesitated for just a moment before returning the embrace. It was a breach of protocol, perhaps, but in that moment, it was simply a child thanking the man who had protected him. The media coverage of the incident gradually faded from the front pages, replaced by other news stories. But within security and law enforcement circles, the attempted kidnapping became a case study. Morrison and his team were invited to speak at training seminars, sharing their experience and the lessons learned. The palace security systems underwent their promised overhaul. New protocols were implemented, technology was upgraded, and additional layers of protection were added. The breach that had allowed the criminals to access internal information was closed, and new cybersecurity measures ensured it couldn't happen again. Mrs. Thompson received a commendation from the royal family for her protective actions. In a private ceremony, the Queen herself thanked her for her dedication and bravery. Mrs. Thompson, typically unflappable, cried during the meeting, overwhelmed by the recognition and the relief that Prince George was safe. 3 months after the incident, Prince George returned to his regular school. The decision had been carefully considered, with input from psychologists, security experts, and the family themselves. There was debate about whether to switch to private tutoring permanently, but William and Catherine believed that George needed the normalcy of school, the interaction with other children his age. Of course, security was enhanced significantly. Additional protection officers were assigned. Routes were varied daily. The school itself underwent security improvements, but the goal was to allow George as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of his position. On his first day back, George was nervous. He worried about how his classmates would treat him, whether they would see him differently after what had happened. But children, he discovered, were remarkably accepting. They asked a few questions, expressed their relief that he was okay, and then moved on to talking about football, homework, and the upcoming school play. At lunchtime, his best friend Thomas sat beside him. "I'm glad you're back," Thomas said simply. "School wasn't the same without you." That simple statement of friendship meant more to George than all the formal statements and news coverage. It reminded him that despite everything, he was still just a boy, still someone with friends and a life beyond his royal title. The trial of Viktor Petrov and his accomplices began 6 months after the attempted kidnapping. The courtroom was packed with journalists, security personnel, and legal observers. The evidence presented was overwhelming: surveillance footage, intercepted communications, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Prince George did not attend the trial. His parents and legal advisors decided he had been through enough, and his testimony wasn't necessary given the strength of the other evidence. Instead, a written statement from him was read to the court, describing his experience and the impact it had on him. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience on the bench, listened to all the evidence before delivering her verdict. Guilty on all counts, she sentenced Petrov to 35 years in prison, ensuring he would be an old man before he ever tasted freedom again. The other captured members of the organization received similar sentences. This court recognizes the severity of these crimes, the judge stated. An attempt to kidnap a child, any child, is heinous, but to target a member of the royal family, to threaten the stability of our nation, represents an attack on our society itself. The sentences reflect the seriousness of these actions. The mastermind known as the director was never caught. Despite the arrests and the seizure of evidence, his true identity remained unknown. Intelligence agencies continued to search for him, but he had seemingly disappeared. Some believed he had fled to a country with no extradition treaty. Others thought he might have assumed a new identity and was lying low, waiting for attention to fade. This uncertainty meant that security around the royal family remained heightened. The threat level had decreased significantly, but complete relaxation was impossible. Detective Morrison and his team remained vigilant, knowing that their job was never truly finished. A year after the incident, on a quiet Sunday morning, Prince George sat in the palace gardens with his father. They were feeding the swans in the pond, a simple activity that George had always enjoyed. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and for a moment everything felt peaceful and normal. "Dad," George said thoughtfully, watching a swan glide across the water, "I've been thinking about what happened last year." William set down the bag of bread he was holding and gave his son his full attention. "What about it?" "I used to think being a prince was just about fancy dinners and waving at people," George explained. "But now I understand it's more complicated than that. There are dangers, but there are also people dedicated to protecting us. There's responsibility, but there's also purpose." William felt a surge of pride at his son's mature reflection. "That's very wise, George." "It is complicated, but I'm glad you're beginning to understand both the challenges and the privileges of your position. Detective Morrison told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid," George continued. "I think I'm still afraid sometimes, but I'm also proud of who I am and what our family represents." "That's all anyone can ask," William said, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. "To acknowledge our fears but not let them control us. To use our position to do good in the world. You're going to be a wonderful king someday, George." They sat together in comfortable silence, father and son, future king and future king, both understanding that their lives would always involve unique challenges, but also unique opportunities to make a difference. Detective Morrison watched from a respectful distance, as he always did when the family was outdoors. His eyes constantly scanned the gardens, the walls, the sky above. He would never forget that morning when masked men had tried to take Prince George. The memory kept him sharp, reminded him why every moment of vigilance mattered. But he also allowed himself a small smile as he watched the prince and his father together, clearly at peace. Morrison had chosen this career to protect people, to stand between innocent individuals and those who would harm them. Days like this, seeing Prince George laughing and talking with his father, reminded him why his job mattered. The attempted kidnapping had changed everyone involved. Prince George had lost some of his innocence but gained wisdom and understanding. William and Catherine had been reminded of the precious fragility of their children's safety. The security team had learned valuable lessons that made them even more effective at their jobs. And the criminals had learned that the protection around the British royal family was far more formidable than they had anticipated. Years would pass, and Prince George would grow into a young man, then eventually into a king. The events of that frightening morning would remain with him, a defining moment that shaped his understanding of duty, courage, and the price of his birthright. But they would not define him. He would be defined by how he responded to that challenge, by the strength he showed in recovering, and by the compassion he developed for others who faced their own trials. The story of the attempted kidnapping near the palace became part of royal history, a reminder that even in modern times, even with all the technology and training available, the royal family faced unique dangers. But it was also a story of heroism, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to protect those in their care. Detective Morrison would eventually retire after many years of distinguished service, but he would always remember Prince George as the young boy he had protected that day. And Prince George would always remember Morrison as the brave officer who had stood between him and danger, who had proved that courage and dedication could overcome any threat. The sun continued to shine on Windsor Castle, as it had for 1,000 years. The ancient walls that had protected kings and queens throughout history stood strong. Inside those walls, a young prince continued to grow, to learn, and to prepare for the destiny that awaited him, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would never face them alone.